And I have the privilege of introducing Asha Nayaswami tonight. And I wanted to just maybe give you just a brief scoop. That's what we say in Texas. So there is a single moment in time that defined Asha Nayaswami's entire life. And that was the moment that she met Swami Kriyananda in 1969 at a Stanford lecture. And from that moment, she and Swami had very close contact, to say the least. She was a cook, a personal secretary. She was the director of publications. And add anything I leave out. She was the head of marketing. She also she is the director, spiritual director of Palo Alto in California.
Of a non-portion of California, which is very small. But anyway, moving right along.
In 1970s, Asha was asked by Swamiji to tour and start teaching and lecturing and speaking. Now, why I say all this is because, well, for those of you who don't know, who is Swami Kriyananda? So this is the big legacy, and I'm so glad that you all are here. Omar, Lola, Sally, Georgia, I know that you all, and Sally, I know you're not new to this at all, but what I'm about to say. Paramahansa Yogananda, it was the first yogi who came to the West from the East and brought the teachings of yoga and the yoga that's union to the West. And so Swami Kriyananda was a direct disciple of Yogananda. And given that Asha, Yogananda left his body, and Swami has left his body, given that Asha is here with us tonight is really quite an honor because she is like the direct connection. And I've learned so many things from Asha already. Our paths have already crossed. I had the honor and privilege of working with Swami Kriyananda on the first part of his films back in 2010. And even though I didn't spend nearly the amount of time that Asha has spent decades, I felt this incredible connection after he left his body. And it really is something hopefully Asha will talk about, and I know she does. But we're just very honored to have her here tonight and to share all of her experiences. And just without further introduction, Asha Nayaswami.
And also, I would say, wrapping up the tour of Texas.
That's good. She's wrapping up the tour of Texas.
Yes. I usually like to start an evening with a little bit of music. This is my friend Omar, who's also from California. And we have been here for 10 days, I guess now. I'm actually on a 6-week trip. We're leaving tomorrow for Italy, where Ananda also has groups. I'll explain all that much more clearly in a few minutes. I tend to lose track of time, especially when I'm traveling, because when you're on an arranged tour where you have friends in every place, you actually don't have to know anything at all. And so I enjoy the mental freedom of just, where we are. When I was really embarrassed in Austin when somebody said, "How are you enjoying Austin?" And I, without thinking, said, "Am I in Austin?" Which was a little rude, and I really should have been more careful than that. But mostly because when people of like spirit are together, it really doesn't make any difference where you are in the world, especially when we're talking about people who meditate or have any inclination toward understanding that we can be instruments of light in this world. We have much more in common with each other than we really have with the population as a whole at this period of time. I was in New Delhi a number of years ago. It would have been when, you'll have to forgive me about this, I think the United States started bombing Yugoslavia. Did we do that at one point for some reason?
Yes.
I was there, and I remember I was sitting at the lunch table with this gentleman, and he said it to me this way: "Oh, you Americans, you're always at war with someone." And I just thought, that is really, when you're inside of it, you don't think about it. When you look at it from the outside, you suddenly see yourself as other people do. And later that day, we were in an apartment somewhere in some hotel in New Delhi, and there were like maybe 5 or 6 countries represented in a group of 15 people. I mean, with different passports. It wasn't just that we had cultural heritage. And we were talking, oh, I know, the gentleman who was there worked in the New Delhi airport. He had the job, basically no plane took off or landed without his approval. I'm not quite sure what position that was, but it was a very influential position. And he was talking about that he'd been up in an airplane in whatever place he was flying, he was watching American bombers go out with their bombs and drop them on whoever they were dropping them on, and then turn around and come back empty, and then the others were coming like this. I mean, just a perspective that the average person doesn't get. I'm not talking about politics or the value of the war, just the world that we live in. And I remember,
It locks.
I'm just trapped.
Not close.
He's trapped between worlds in the hallway. But I remember just commenting to that group of people that, that all of us at that point, I said, we should have passports that call us the nation of self-realization. And we should have our basic country passports are secondary. We should all have that passport. We should be allowed to travel without visas across all borders, because our presence is just going to be of benefit if we can carry the light within us and just harmonize all of these different energies. I realized, however, by the time the world would recognize something like that, I'm going to go all the way back to the late 60s, which I was talking to someone about it being, people study it in school now, but it was really just my life. And I remember when we used to go across the border to Canada, which people did from where I was, and they were always concerned that you were bringing marijuana, which was illegal across the border. But you could actually say to the guards, oh no, I don't have any drugs, I meditate. And apparently it would get you across, truthful or otherwise. But I was also thinking that by the time the world would let us, if light-minded souls could actually be considered a separate species and a separate nation, we wouldn't need it anymore, because the world would be very enlightened. But alas, we're not there yet. So my responsibility in the world primarily at this moment, since COVID stopped, or since we can at least pretend it's over and then just travel and hope for the best, is just this, just to move from place to place and gather together people of like mind and share with you some of what I learned from Swami Kriyananda. So that's the entire and only purpose here. But I'm not here to convert you to what has been meaningful to me, but only to offer the opportunity for us to talk about what is meaningful to all of us, and how and in what ways the power of these great souls can help us be better at what we were born to do. So, before that, Gambar will help us lead us in a chant. We'll have a few minutes of meditation. We'll have a couple of fun songs, and then we'll see what happens after that. We never know. Okay.
So this chant and the 2 songs that we were both are called by Swami Kriyananda. And I invite you to sing along if you feel to. The words are very simple. Lord, I am thine, I am thine, I am thine. Be thou mine, oh, be thou mine. I am thine, I am thine. Lord, I am thine, I am thine, I am thine. Lord, I am thine, I am thine. Lord, I am thine, I am thine, I am thine. Lord, I am thine, I am thine. Be thou mine, oh, be thou mine. Be thou mine, oh, be
let's just be silent together. If you have a way of calming your mind, concentrating at the point between the eyebrows or resting in the heart, just allow that calm, quiet energy to come into you. We have a unique opportunity to share with one another, even though some of us are meeting for the first time. The spirit and the light unites us beyond our personalities and the individual lives we have. And the more we can move our attention away from what divides us into what unifies us, the more inspired will be our sharing, the more joyful, and the more deeply each one of us individually can connect with the greater reality of which we are all a part. So for just a few minutes, let's sit in this unified silence.
Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach my heart to impart everywhere your delight. Sing of moon rays on the rain, sing that love's not in vain. Every grief, every wrong has its ending in song. Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach all men how to spin clouds of gloom into light. Without silence, what is song? Without night, where is dawn? Were it not for men's woes, who would smile at a rose? Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Let each tone silence groan, earth and heaven unite. Morning laughter, evening tears, snow and blossoms all fade. Joy must sing in the night to face change unafraid. Nightingale, nightingale,
Well, half the room are people I've been seeing ever since I got to Texas 10 weeks ago, and half the room are people I've never met before, so we've got kind of a lot to knit together this evening. So let's just see where we go. For those of you who came in earlier, Colin gave you a little bit of my background, but let me just talk about it a little bit more in the context of thinking about how anything that I know or could share with you might resonate with something that's important to you. As half of the room that knows me knows already, I was actually born in Texas. My father was stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso during the war, Second World War. You have to say which war these days. He was not a soldier type. He was a mathematician who got drawn out of graduate school and got drafted really early. which of course the whole course of his life was determined by that. Otherwise he would have been a PhD professor somewhere, but everything got sent in another direction. As he said to me when I got old enough to understand, it would never have been possible for him to actually be a fighting soldier. I think it just would have broken him in ways that he never could have recovered from. So he made himself indispensable by creating mathematical ways of helping to train people to be good with artillery. And he said he just really applied himself to creating things that made him invaluable this side. So that's basically what he was doing there. And by the time he was released from the army, my brother was already born and I was close behind. My sister didn't come for a little while later, so I lived in El Paso till I was 15. And then we moved to Southern California, and I've never left California since then. But it was sort of that expansive Texas desert, and we lived, right on the border there, and I rode horses, not very well, but I did. And we used to go out to that really deserty place, and there was a huge radio tower. I was just thinking about all this yesterday. There was a huge radio tower next to the stable, so we could just go out across the desert. And the borders were just completely different then. I remember just going right to the river, the Rio Grande, just going back and forth across the river. Nobody ever stopped us. Everything is so different. I'm not that old. I was born right after the war, but I'm not that old, but well, I am. Depends on who you are. What am I saying? I was actually talking to someone this morning who's just the same age as me, and no, she's younger than I, but we were talking about time, because when I was in my 20s, I've been doing what I've been doing for 50 years. And I know we have a lot of different ages in this room, and so you all are looking at 50 years the way I'm about to say. When my whole life was 20 years, the concept of 50 was just incomprehensible. There was no imagination that could take you to it, and you certainly didn't expect to be functioning 50 years after that, You might be in a wheelchair over in a corner, and somebody would be feeding you blended vegetables. But the thing about time is that there's nothing you can hold in your hand to represent it. And when you're at an earlier stage of the incarnation, you somehow think that time accumulates, like money or furniture or library books or something like that, so that you think after a lot of years have passed that you'll have this big heap of years. You know what I mean? Like something that you can see that looks really tangible. And the really odd thing about time is when it's gone, it isn't. It just isn't. And one can remember, one has memories, one has feelings about the things that happened, and I have as it happens, I have a pretty good memory for the things that matter to me. And so I can remember lots of incidences, but they fill no space, those memories. They're just vibrations that move in me, and some of them more vivid. It's fascinating, but there's no way you can grasp it. So the whole feeling of it is very, very different when you're on this side of it than when you're on that side of it. And by any measure, in all likelihood, I'm closer to the end of my life than the beginning. Although I was consulting a medical psychic about a few things, I have good health, but I had a few questions I was interested in asking her. And I was being casual because both my parents died in their early 80s, which is less than a decade from my present age. And so I said to her, all we have to do is keep the car running for another, 8 or 9 years. She said to me, oh no, you're going to live to be 103. That's what she actually said to me. I didn't know. I said, oh my gosh, She's a pretty reliable lady, but I won't say she's infallible. But she said, but you'll be fine. You'll be healthy and you'll be mentally acute. As soon as you lose any of that, you'll just leave your body. It'll be over like that. but was very interesting to me. And it was, whether she was true or not is not relevant. I mean, is not as important as the effect her words had on me. Because I realized that I was really the horse heading for the stable right now. You know, just no longer smelling the flowers, no longer looking around, no longer feeling seriously responsible, and just checking things off without actually doing them. You know, just throwing them away, like it's over, I don't have to think about it anymore. And I was just cutting my losses and heading for the exit. But I realized that's a terrible attitude to have, because as long as we are conscious in this body, we have an opportunity to grow. We have an opportunity to expand. We have an opportunity to give. And I remember when I was 50 years old, which was 25 years ago to be specific, and some of you know that the spiritual community of Ananda that I've been part of, how do you say it? There was another spiritual organization very closely related that Swami Kriyananda had been a part of and then wasn't a part of. The history of churches in the USA is always, there is the first church of, you know, whether it's spiritual or religious or whatever, there's the first church of. Almost always there's some separation among the early members. Either somebody is expelled or somebody leaves in a huff, one way or another. Then they start the second church of, and the first church of always thinks that the second church of, you know, in some way is illegitimate. So we got caught up in 12 years of litigation, which is why when you said, I have a trial tomorrow, was a very familiar phrase to me. The whole bhavan of an attorney is very well known to me, because I spent 12 years in it. And in the end, we won what was really important. We ended up being vilified as being morally reprehensible, but that was just sort of part of the story. And then we just went on with our lives. But after that experience, which came to me from my late 40s, all through the decade from my late 30s, I had gone from being a naive child to a full-grown person, a full-grown adult. Because we start out thinking, especially if you're a flower child from the 60s and you're out there, with your goats and your organic gardens and you're doing all this stuff and you think you're creating a new world and you have all this thing and you think everybody's always going to love you and that's just the way it's going to be. And then you get to enter into the grown-up world of well, there you have it. And when that whole thing was over and we had won and lost, and we just walked away from it and just decided this is not our world, we'll just be ourselves. I had this experience where I realized that my lighthearted nature had been automatic. And now, partly because of that experience and partly just because of the passing of time, I kept waiting for my natural buoyancy to return, after having really been challenged by the fact that not everybody in the world is nice. And not everybody has, you understand what I mean. We were really involved with some very disillusioning energy, okay? So there I am, I'm 50 years old, and I'm just waiting to turn back to being 15, is essentially what I was doing. And I realized it's just not going to happen. And I realized deeply something I'd heard Swami Kriyananda say a lot of times, which is there's two kinds of innocence. There's the innocence of naivete that just has never been exposed to anything, to any shadow force, and therefore has a completely positive attitude toward the world. This is what, thank God, little babies express all the time, or puppies. This is why we like puppies so much. P.G. Wodehouse, the English humorist,
Swami Kriyananda really liked him a lot, so we all sort of, I say grew up, listening and reading P.G. Wodehouse. And one of the stories that he wrote was called The Shy Man, was the name of the story. And it was written from the dog's point of view. And the dog's owner, the dog felt that the man was very shy, so the dog put it upon himself to get the man more involved with his neighbors and with the people around. Turned out the dog's owner was a burglar and a criminal. And so the reason he was always hiding out was to hide his activities. And the dog helped him, to make friends with the police and other people around, It was a totally ridiculous story, but it presents to you, just depending on how you're looking at it. So there I was, and I was 50, and it occurred to me on a very profound level. I mean, I wasn't this stupid, but on a much more profound level, that happiness was a choice. And that I'd been lucky, I'd had good karma, I would call it, that I had a nice family, everything moved easily for me, I had good karma, things worked. But from that point, I was going to have to every day make a decision as to whether or not I would keep being upward moving with my energy, or if I would gradually age out of the system, which is what we see people do. People just quit at a certain point. Some people quit at the age of 10. It's just too hard. Either their own upbringing was too hard, or their whatever it is. But we're always having a choice. And when this woman told me that I had 3.5 decades or 2.5 decades to go instead of less than 1, I saw again, there I'm sitting. I'm just deciding, but what would that serve? How would that serve? To just lower our energy and do less and less until the lights go out for the last time. Depending on whatever the age is. Like, why were we born? What are we doing here? What is the purpose of it? And the actual question behind that is quite simply, what causes happiness and what causes suffering? And it's such a simple question. When Paramahansa Yogananda, he wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, many of you know that book, when he came to America in 1920, which was just over 100 years ago, which is not very long in the great scheme of time and distance in history, he came with this enormous tradition of India, which is, multiple religions, multiple expressions of each of those religions. I mean, a history that we in America can't even imagine. I did not travel out of this country until I was in my mid-30s. I didn't have a passport even. I came to this fledgling community in the foothills of the Sierras in 1971, and I've been part of Ananda, which was where I was until this present moment. I helped start that community, and more than 15 years later, I helped start another one in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, where I still live, where I'm the spiritual director of Palo Alto, but Palo Alto doesn't know that or care. But I am involved in our community there. But I never left the country because we were just too busy doing what we were doing. And finally I traveled with Swami Kriyananda. We went through a tour of Europe. I went to Florence. For the first time, and he had many friends there, so I met a lot of Florentines and Italians that I wouldn't have met if I'd just been on my own. And I was so surprised to find out that people in Florence were very proud of the fact that Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci had been part of their city. And it was the first time, again, I realized that I was an American. You don't realize that you're an American until you're not in America. Also, one of my Indian friends was talking about, this was very early in my world travels, but he said something to me about something about his friend, and but after that he married a white woman, he said. And I said, white woman, you mean someone like me? He said, yeah, someone like you, and he sort of said it like, oh, he married a white woman. And it was just marvelous, like, of course. Just depends on which side of the fence you're sitting on. You don't mean to be narrow in your thinking, but if you've never been exposed to something else, then suddenly it's completely different. And so when I got to Florence, I realized that all these people were really proud of something that had absolutely nothing to do with them. It was just their address. And it made me realize what a positive thing it is to be in such a young country, our country, because it puts the burden of everything right on us. There's just so little behind us that we can claim, gradually we're getting an inch. And so you see, since 1987 is like a really big, like, ancient history. But Yogananda comes from India, thousands of years. Nobody even knows how old his teaching is. And he came to America. He lived in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was just, Hollywood and just all this brand new stuff, because he wanted us in this country and ultimately in the whole world to just start over from a spiritual perspective. And he had one really serious intent, which is he wanted us to not in a disrespectful way, but in a like let's prune the tree sort of way, which is what is the essence of spiritual life. And the essence of spiritual life is not what you belong to. It's not the dogmas you can list. I have, Dambara being one of them, but I have 3 friends who grew up, as it happened, all grew up in San Francisco, all grew up in Irish Catholic families. And if you poke them in the right way, they'll start reciting the Catholic catechism to you, which it was just like, I never heard such a thing. And they just blah, 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 God is this happens like this. And it was like, oh my gosh. And hundreds of years of, just building up that idea. And in India, thousands of years of building up this ritual and that ritual. Yogananda wiped the whole slate clean. And he started teaching people how to meditate. And the nature of meditation is it's just you. That's why we find it so difficult, because it's just me and me. And now he brought it to us with devotion to the greater reality of which we are a part. And he even talked a great deal about God as in the compassionate form of the mother. But even without any of that, just the possibility that there is another dimension that I can access if I choose to access it. And that is not only the definition of my spiritual self, in fact, it's the definition of myself. And he did it for one reason, and the reason was, it will show us what causes suffering and what brings happiness. And if one explores that inner world sufficiently, then everything else will reveal itself. And you don't need a priest, and you don't need a ritual. Now, I myself am clergy, and somebody mentioned the blue. I always wear blue because this is my initiation color. So I have added some of the accoutrements of a dedicated spiritual life. And I do it because it helps me. Every day when I look at my closet and I sigh and I think, okay, one more blue day. It helps me remember, and it puts a little bit of a, what would you say the word? In a positive sort of way, it constantly reminds me not to lose my way. And that's the primary power of it. Whatever external reality has is something else, but really the reality of it is first and foremost for the one who's doing it. But what we're all doing, and this is what our age is like right now. I mean, traditions that nobody thought would ever shift. Family life, marriage, gender roles, just churches, spirituality, races, ethnicities, it's so scrambled. In where I live in Palo Alto, and I've mentioned this every time I've talked practically since I've come here, there's no dominant culture. I mean, it's really quite something. We're so used to it now. I can take a walk around the neighborhood that I live in, which isn't, it's an affluent area comparatively. There's so many other way more affluent areas where I live that we're not exactly the poor relations, but we're definitely on the edge of it. I can hear 3 or 4 languages just walking a couple of blocks. And you see everywhere, you see culturally mixed couples. Whereas before, everybody would always just be in their little box. My favorites always are the white man in the Indian family. And he's got 100 of his Indian relatives around him and his wife, and he's the deer in the headlights, just sitting there. It tends to be more that way, It tends to be more that the white man married the Indian woman than the other way around, or the Chinese family with one Caucasian in there. And I actually believe that I see more culturally and ethnically mixed couples than I see the same. Now, who cares? But it's just interesting, isn't it? Everybody is going toward who I am inside instead of who I appear to be outside. And this is not an accident. There's whole wonderful long things I could talk about the evolution of the planet and where we're going, and there's all this. But all of us are in this now. And the question is, what's being asked of us? Why is this happening? Why was I born now? And what side of this whole story do I really want to be on? In other words, how can I help? How can I serve? How can I be an instrument of light? And we're also living in times, and I do feel this very passionately. I've felt this from the very beginning, meaning very beginning of my essentially adult life. I was 18 years old when I found out that there was just like a whole nother way to think about life, which was Indian teachings came to me, but it was more just like, there's just a whole nother way to think about this. And then I met Swami, as Colin was saying, when I was 1969, when I was 22. So, and then I just threw my lot in. I've never done anything else. But what I've had the privilege of doing is representing where I think the whole world is going, which is we are part of a greater reality. We are all interdependent with each other, the plants, the trees, the creatures, and but simultaneously, there's a whole group of people, I call them Divine Mother's rowdy children, who are trying really hard to keep everything as it used to be, and are fighting really hard against this other force that is really moving us together. And it's not an age where you can just kind of sit quietly and just do what your grandparents did and just have it be okay. It's like there's too many uncertainties. But such a time is a tremendous opportunity for personal growth. Just a tremendous opportunity to discover that we are so much bigger than we thought we were. And we can be so much kinder than we thought we could be. We can be so much more compassionate than we thought. And it's also a time when I feel that we're being called to behave that way. Because if you think about how things happen, we see the material manifestation here, but everything begins on the level of ideas and of thought. I mean, just you look at this building. Somebody had an idea to build this building. There was a time when this building wasn't here. And somebody somewhere thought, oh, I could build a building. And then they applied energy to it. They figured out how it was going to look and where they were going to get the money and who they were going to hire and how they were going to use it. So idea, energy, and then here we sit in these comfortable chairs. And everything that manifests in this world, including attitudes and politics and prejudices and expansive thinking, it all starts as ideas. And far more than most people realize, it's on that level of ideas and energy. That's where real change takes place. By the time it's manifesting in this world, it's like and really, literally, it's over. So it's much more important where we're going and how we're using our energy. Swamiji said once, he said, if you judge yourself at all, which I don't recommend, he said, you don't look at what you've already accomplished. He said, look what you aspire to become. Because we are, just as I was talking about time, all those years of experience, where is it? The only thing that's actually happening is what is coming through us now, who I am now. I could have been the nicest person or the worst person I could have, which I don't happen to have, but I could have a very dark history behind me. If I go back enough incarnations, I'm sure I'll find that dark history. And even in this one, I was naughty at some times. I was on the rowdy side of Divine Mother's children. I played with the bad kids sometimes, but mostly it's a pretty clean story. But in this moment, I could become evil just like that, if I chose to be, or if I was inclined to be, and then that's who I would be. So all we are is just what we are in this moment, and what we are radiating is determining the fate of the planet. And certainly, I don't mean like we are determining the fate of the planet, but we are certainly determining the aura in which we live, and we are building the habits and the self-definition that's going to decide who we're going to be tomorrow. This is why Swami said, what you are now is just the end of everything that you've already done. What you will be is according to what you're doing today. And the world that we're going to live in is going to be determined by what we're doing today. And there's a huge movement toward the light going on in the world now. Huge. I was very discouraged for a while, and then one day I just realized that's just silly. Because everywhere people are feeling that we're being called to something. However you express it, doesn't make any difference. So my offering in this moment is a lot of commitment and some unique experience with a very fine teacher about sort of how we move and what we do. And so I'm going to open this for questions and discussion because I think I've said enough. So, comments, thoughts, questions?
Does evil exist? Do you believe in evil?
Absolutely, evil exists. You just look all around and look at it, but you have to call it what it is. Evil is a misunderstanding of where happiness comes from. And some people misunderstand so deeply that they behave in such a way that far from bringing happiness to themselves or to anyone else, they create what I like to think of as shadow, because they block the light. I mean, when I was talking about being 50 years old, because of the fact that the litigation that we were involved in was a theological dispute, which never should have gone into a secular court, and when two sides are motivated by theological, this is what God wants, actions can be quite extreme. And because religious freedom is the law of the United States, and the attempt by church number one against church number two, we were number two, was religious monopoly. It was a really bad case, and it never should have gotten there because they really didn't have a chance. But they ended up with an attorney, and Swami Kriyananda described him as the closest thing to the personification of evil that we are likely to encounter in our lives, which was, whoa, that was quite a hot thing to say. I wrote a book about Swami Kriyananda, which is in the other room, and I didn't even put that attorney's name in the book. I just called him X. I couldn't bear to type his name.
I think I'll see him tomorrow.
I don't know if he practices in Texas. I hope he doesn't.
Maybe reincarnated.
Yeah, he's reincarnated. But actually, Swami Kriyananda, he took him on one day in a deposition. I mean, there's just so many stories I could tell you, and Swami just he said he felt God telling him to talk to this man. And he said, I don't know what you're like in your personal life, but in your professional life, you're a sadist. He He said, I think you became an attorney because it gave you license to hurt people. And he said, willingly and deliberately to hurt people, he said, I can't think of a more accurate definition of evil than that. And it was just right there. That was why, you get involved with that reality. But you have to take it and you have to add in reincarnation. If you don't have reincarnation, you're just stuck on this one. So I just have to put it in there. When I first heard about reincarnation when I was 18, it was a bit of an odd idea for me, but I've thought about it for decades and I've become quite convinced. If you add in reincarnation, whatever happens in one life is just the chapter in a big book. And we are all on a journey to understand what causes suffering and what causes happiness so that we can live in perfect joy, which is how our Creator intended for us to live. So people make mistakes. And the darn thing is, you see, we don't live from being told. We don't change from being told. If anybody remembers their childhood, they remember that. What did your parents say to you and how much did you listen? You just have to go out and you have an experience. And when you have an experience, then you know. So we are all, and this is a hard thing to appreciate, we are all equally loved by God. We are all equally an expression of the Creator, and we are all equally loved by God. That's why I refer to these people as rowdy children of Divine Mother, because they are. And we have as many lifetimes as we care to take to figure it out. And we have many, many lifetimes, so we get to try. Wow, if I have power over people, if I get to exercise, be unkind and cruel to them, how does that make me feel? Well, in the moment, you might feel really big. But what happens next life and next life and next life and next life when that karma begins to catch up with you? And we all get to learn. We all get to learn. And it's a challenging concept, but you just look around you. There's no other word for what some people do. You just have to call it evil. You can be naive about it, but you have to also realize, and Swami put it this way. He wrote this after, I think it was actually when the Iraqi war started, and there was a lot of controversy, and people became very popular to denigrate America by Americans. And Swami said very simply, just because evil exists everywhere does not mean that evil is present in the same proportion everywhere, which is an extremely important thing to understand. So even if a country or a person or a group of people make bad mistakes, you can't throw them away merely because part of it is misguided. And then in some context, the hurtful actions are enormous. It's just the way this world is. And that's part of the innocence of wisdom versus the innocence of childhood, which is we can be happy when we're living in a dream world. It's when we actually can confront this world as it is and still find the capacity to be compassionate and loving and appropriate. And appropriate is the key word. When you're in the face of darkness, and that darkness has more power to be dark than you have to love them into being good, you have to be appropriate in how you respond to it. And oftentimes, because people don't want to admit that there is a shadow force in this world, they don't behave appropriately. And that's what we get to learn. It's one of the ways we get to learn.
Can I finish up? Is the goal to face the devil, to stare the devil in the face?
If the devil's bigger than you,
I know that. But how close is that the goal? Is to be be unshaken.
No.
To be able to not be taken.
No, that is not a helpful way to think of it. The goal of life is to attune ourselves to the unconditional love of the divine and to receive in our hearts the joy of attunement with God. And it's not our job to deal with evil because it's too big an assignment for us. It's too big an assignment. You seek God for joy, and when that joy comes into you, kindness and compassion come into you also. For example, in the litigation that we were involved in, this woman brought a sexual harassment suit against us. It was all part of the same story. This woman, it was complete fabrication. It was so preposterous. One of the reasons we lost is that it was so preposterous. But she won. And when I was sitting in the courtroom and I found out that she'd won, I was so proud of myself afterwards, I have to say. My first impulse was, oh, that poor girl. Not only has she perpetrated this false thing, but she won. And that means that the delusion in her mind that she's done a good thing is even bigger. And it's going to take her even longer, and the consequences will be worse. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the merging of Eastern and Western thought with yoga and meditation, and the gap that occurred, maybe just a way to say it, between the pew, organized religion, and meditation and yoga, and the World Brotherhood colony?
So you want me to stay for 3 days and just never stop talking?
What you can say about that? Because it's, the nature, the yoga, all of it is so wonderful.
Let's see what...
And then how it got from there to that.
Well, what's happening now is that form is giving way to energy. It's like, I'll use marriage as an example. The form of marriage used to be just inviolable. Nobody could even think about it. It was a man and a woman, and it was for life. Beginning, middle, end of the story. Now, divorce is very common. My generation was the one that really started getting divorced. Let's see, how did it go? When my brother got divorced, my uncle got divorced, which was actually really interesting. It was sort of like once it entered the family, then a different generation also felt that they could move. Now it's more common than not. When this a couple in our community, Jyotish and Devi, who are the spiritual directors of Ananda after Swami Kriyananda, they have a boy, and they were living in San Francisco for a while, and he went to just a regular preschool or nursery school. He comes home and he says to his mother, "Mommy, do you have a boyfriend?" And she said, "No, I don't have a boyfriend. Daddy is my husband." And he says, "Well, all the other children, their mothers have boyfriends." And it was just like, yeah, everything is just really different than it used to be. So now, on one hand, that's very destabilizing, just intensely destabilizing. And the generations are having a very interesting time because so many kids' mothers have boyfriends, meaning that there's just everything is shifting what used to be solid. And there's many people who are panicked about it. But what is also happening is this the way Swami put it, people are making their actual experience the criteria for their values and their decisions. And so many people who, didn't get divorced, there was no victory there. There was no growth there. There was just rigidity of form. And people always took religion that way too. A friend of mine was a Lutheran minister for a long time. And it was like, he said something on the order of, I could go to any town and start a Lutheran church. And people used to go. You go to a town and you're a Methodist, you're a Lutheran, you're Congregationalist. Now people, if they go to church at all, they'll look for a place that inspires them. Because they're looking for energy, they're not looking for form. But this is a battle, this is a reality, and there's cosmic reasons for all of this. But this is actual progress. But when you're in a transition time like we are, there's a tremendous amount of energy that wants to hold as it was. At the same time, there's a new energy that just won't be silenced. So, people cling to form and try to just keep things going as they were. And then there's pioneers of all ages, of all ethnicities, of all countries. And if you look at the whole world, that's what you're seeing right now. You're seeing those who are desperately holding on to form at any price. The Russian Empire has to be expanded and has to own all of these countries. And these countries are saying, what are you talking about? You know, we are our own people. We're going to be this. This church is trying to prove that they're the only one and trying to crush the others. And people say, what are you talking about? And that's what we're caught in right now. That's why we have to actually, though, not be superficial in our experience, because this is a real struggle that's going on. So we have to be standing deep where we're standing. You know, that experience of being challenged as we were with all that litigation it's like, I have to really know what I believe in, what I feel to be true, and what I feel to be true from my experience, especially when Ananda was assaulted and really Kriyananda was vilified, and everybody, we were just all, it was a time when every ashram in America was attacked at the same time. And so it's like, you know, are we just an abusive cult? And I never tried to persuade anybody that we weren't. Because if I could persuade you that we weren't, then the next person could persuade you that we were. So it was just like, I don't know, what do you think? What kind of experience have you had? You know me. Do I look like the kind of person who would be abused? And some of the men, when it was all sexual, some of the men would sort of jokingly say, is there something going on I don't know about? You know, and that sort of became the joke. But no, there was nothing going on. But in this culture, you can just accuse, and it gets pretty crazy after that, because there's a real war going on here. I don't know if that was your question, but that was my answer. I hope they relate it. Any other questions?
You and I were having an interesting conversation earlier about energy and thought and all of that, and she kind of touched on that, and I thought you might have a question you might want to ask.
I mean, I don't want to sound, it's more of what I would refer to as maybe a little more radical thinking, but I'll talk about it because I feel comfortable talking about it.
Okay, good.
So you touched on a number of things that I could sit and talk to you forever, but you talked about vibrations, right? And I think that could be a discussion for an entire day. You talked about a number of other things about, what the purpose of life is, and reincarnation. I think, I try to focus on practicing, trying to break that cycle of rebirth.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Really what we try to do. But it's hard, especially in one lifetime, and you have to go back so many other lifetimes to do that. But the concept that we were talking about is the concept of the power of thought, or the speed of thought, more like that. So one of the things that I've read up on that, so as you're meditating, you're trying to concentrate, right? Whether you have a mantra, or you focus on a word, or you focus on an object or whatever, you're trying to concentrate. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to enter into the spirit world, right? So one of the things that I do when I first sit down is I sit down, I close my eyes, I breathe a little bit, and I say thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. And then I also say that I'm coming in peace. So I'm stepping into the spirit world, and so I want the spirit world to know that I come in peace, right? That I don't mean any harm, right? I'm searching, I'm looking. And so, everyone always, science says that the fastest thing that travels is the speed of light, 176,000 miles per second, I think it is, something along those lines. And so I've read on some things that I can share with you at a later date, but the power of thought, or the speed of thought, is actually the thing that travels the fastest. And it goes back to the concept of vibrations.
Your thought's instantaneous.
Instantaneously. So
Right.
it travels at 17 trillion miles per second. And what happens is every time you have a thought, it travels out into this ether, right? Just out there.
Well, thought is completely non-material, so there's no such thing as miles or speed.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and again, that's to be debated as far as the speed or the rate, or, what sort of what sort of device did you use to calculate that speed,
Right.
But essentially, the point is that the speed of thought travels exponentially faster than the speed of light. And it travels out into this ether, and it vibrates with similar energy. So if it's a positive thought, like my mom always taught me, think positive, be positive. So you send that positive energy out there, so it vibrates, it connects with other
Right, precisely.
positive energy,
Precisely.
and instantaneously comes right back. And so what's a unique concept about that is as you do that in your day-to-day life, in your material world, right? Not the time that you're spending in the spiritual world necessarily concentrating and trying to be focused simply in that area. That positive energy starts to carry you into that spirit world a little more seamlessly because it starts to become part of your being. So it's about how you react.
Well, so the question in this point is, to the extent that people have come, because I have the front chair and you have that chair, I'm going to take where you went, and I'm going to just share with you how Kriyananda and Yogananda have taken those same thoughts and just explain them in a way that's very consistent with what you've said, but might also be of interest to people.
Sure.
And this is how, in Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda has this one line that says, thoughts are not individually created, they're universal. And we do not actually create our own thoughts, we merely attune ourselves to vibrations of consciousness that already exist in the universe. So that's even a step beyond that I send my thoughts out and they unify with other thoughts. And that also, skips over the question of what's traveling where. And what we're dealing with is that there are many simultaneously existing levels of consciousness, from the most evil, depraved level of consciousness to the saints and the masters whose consciousness is infinite. Jesus, Krishna, Yogananda, I would put in that company also. But those masters who are God realized, who have realized the infinite. And our own destiny is that ultimately we will all ascend, or however you want to call it, we will all realize our actual true nature. And realize is the right word. Yogananda called his work self-realization with the capital S, as opposed to the little s. And realization is interesting because you don't acquire it, you don't earn it, you don't, get points, you don't win it in a lottery. It's always there and you become aware of it. So it's a question not of acquisition, but of suddenly knowing something that wasn't created when you knew it, but you suddenly knew it. So all of us, all the time, by whatever we're doing, we are always vibrating on a certain level, and as a consequence, we are reflecting that level of awareness. If you know anybody who has an inclination to be depressed, they can be in the happiest party, and everything that happens will make them sad. It has nothing to do with anything that's going on. They have just locked their thought band into what I call the geologic strata of that. When I was going through a personal difficulty in my life and I was sad, I was grief-stricken a lot of the time, I felt myself, I would just go into the geological strata of grief. And I would almost like I would forget what the grief was about. It was just my life experience had opened it, my radio receiving station, which was my own self, locked on that channel, and it just was flooded by it. But if I shifted my channel by meditating, by singing, by standing outside, by the grace of God, exactly the same circumstances, but I'd changed my radio frequency, so to speak. And that's actually what we're doing. We are part of a greater reality. We appear to be individual, but that individual appearance is created by the physical body. And on more subtle levels than the physical body, we are part of this greater reality of vibration. So it's a question of what we tune into. And then this world is still here, but it just looks different to us. When I saw that woman win all that money from us that we had to pay her, I could have looked at her in an entirely different way, but I just looked at her as some poor soul who's gotten herself in a lot of trouble and is now going to just be in more trouble. But I could have seen her on any one of those levels, and that's why I felt I was so lucky that I happened to just look at her on that level. And so, but it's also true, and this is the other half of what you're saying, that what we emanate, think about it this way, when you're angry with someone, and you give that anger to someone else, by the time it reaches them, some of the force that came through you reaches them, but the full power of the force actually affects you. Anger, fury, vengeance, anything that you have, you're the one who's most affected, and it becomes a habit. This is a whole metaphysics of the chakras and all this sort of thing. What we do creates an enduring energy pattern, which creates magnetism, which causes us to call more of that same energy into us. But the worst criminal, if he has a revelation, and often saved by Jesus Christ, and I'm so glad that he does continue to save people, he becomes a good person the next day. It's like, what happened? He just changed the frequency and shifted over to the next one. And so we're much more engaged with each other and engaged with this universe than we may realize. And it gets extremely interesting. When I first started this in my early 20s, I didn't know I'd be so fascinated 50 years later that, like every day I'm learning something new about, because once you start increasing your awareness, think about it this way. If you didn't know something and you learned it, and I've been behaving this way. My family, we were very intellectual, and my brother was a champion debater. My brother was state champion debater of the state of Texas twice. I was 50. 50 was a big year for me. When I found out that conversation was not debate. I always thought that debate was conversation. And I lost a lot of friends, But I became aware of something that had always been there. And all of us, we just become aware of something. And then you become aware of something else. What is the limit? What is the limit of what you may not know now that you could know? All the saints and masters say, infinite. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That which I do, ye shall do, and greater things. This is what Jesus himself said, what to speak of what the Bhagavad Gita tells us. Is there any limit? No. Is there any limit, therefore, to our joy, to our freedom, to our power? No. And everything else just becomes waves on the ocean. It's a very happy prospect.
I think the teachings that you reflect are identical.
Yeah.
I think you talked about self-realization.
Mm-hmm.
And what's ironic about that, or the paradox about that, is you have self-realization when you sort of let go of your own ego, right? The attachments and what you have. But also I think it's a cosmic consciousness is what
Exactly.
I was taught.
And another way to think about ego, it's a little confusing to think about ego, even though it's a very good word and we have to use it. Because we all have egos. Jesus Christ had an ego, Yogananda had an ego, in the sense that there was a unique expression that was related to the body he was in that he had to express. And all of us are operating, we have to operate this body, it's part of what we have to do. And ego is simply the infinite identified with the limitation. And it all emanates from having just one body and all the things that come with it. One race, one ethnicity, one gender. Well, not nowadays. You can have multiple genders, but you used to be able to just have one. And all of one age, all of these things, life experience. That's what ego is. It's that I've become identified by this and defined by this. But even when you become infinite in your understanding, if you're still living in a physical body, you still have to keep it going. So a piece of you has to stay identified. So it's not helpful to consider the ego, an enemy. It's just a limited way of defining yourself. So what you want to do is you want to put the ego in context. Swami Kriyananda had a marvelous way of saying it. He said, I never identify with being Swami Kriyananda. He said, but Kriyananda is an event for which I am responsible. And it was such, and has always been such a free way to think about it. And therefore, I have to pay attention. I can't just jettison it. But I don't want to say that just because I'm responsible for this event, that's who I am. If you put on a big event, you have to be conscious of it. But if you actually think that it's you, then you've lost your marbles a little bit, which is how we look to the enlightened masters. We look like we've lost our marbles, if we ever had any. Yes, Mike.
We see this light. This light, physics, as I understand it, says that light has mass, it's small, and that, of course, that mass is equivalent to energy.
You're an engineer talking to a non-engineer, but go ahead.
But this idea about mass and energy is something
Okay.
that teaches about. That it's equal to energy is the way we say it. I mean,
Yeah.
the scientists might say it's equivalent. Small thing. But in meditating, where we experience the 8 aspects of the divine, one of which is light, is that light of the astral world without mass, or is it of the material world? In other words, is it not a different light? Does it not just show us that the soul has the capacity outside of any material reality to plug into light, in a higher light in an astral sense?
Yes, of course. I mean, we're not at all limited by this physical body. This physical body is quite incidental. We're perfectly capable. But Yogananda talks about this in a very interesting way. He said the reason that the human body is more valuable than other forms of life is not because of human chauvinism or sectarianism, but it's because the human nervous system is sophisticated enough to be able to perceive infinity. And that's what makes the human nervous system different. And medical people, doctors, they don't understand why, since nature is usually so efficient, there's all this unused capacity in the human nervous system. Because we use, 10% of our brain power or something like that? But a master uses 100% of it. And so by the time you have evolved to the point where you have a human body, you have the potential within you to perceive infinity. And yes, you're right here in your human body and you're perceiving infinity. So yes, of course, we can be liberated from all of this. Now this to me, I'm just quoting to you from the books. This is not me. It's a funny thing when you begin to really understand these subtle teachings. You get an intuitive understanding that it's true, even though you can't really say why it's true. And also, the path that I follow is a discipleship path. So you come to the point where you have had enough experience that you believe certain individuals are telling you the truth, even though you can't yourself act on that to verify it. And I'm a very aggressive person with my mind, and so I lived with Swami Kriyananda in close association for 45 years of his life. I never took anything. Well, he himself, the way he described his relationship with Yogananda was, I followed him unhesitatingly, but not unquestioningly, which was just a beautiful balance. So so I learned with Swamiji that the chances that he was right and I was wrong was pretty good. But if I couldn't see why he was right, I didn't accept that he was. But I didn't reject what he said either. I basically just stored it over here to see what would happen. Because I had to be true to myself. But part of my truth was that he had proved himself to be trustworthy. And so therefore, how do you balance those? So I just took a wait-and-see attitude, which has served me quite well, because as my life passes, then you begin to know things you didn't know. And I'm so glad I didn't reject them, because otherwise you reject wisdom that's greater than your own, and you, well, one of the pop culture phrases that I always really liked was, oh, fight for your delusions and the reward is you get to keep them. It's like, really, is that a prize? So then you start being more careful about what do I believe and why do I believe it. Okay? Okay, I'm going to take just one more question, and then we have a second venue where we're going to be served refreshments. And we can go in and have more informal conversation. Yes? Uh-huh.
Recently started following you on Instagram.
Oh.
You have a post on there that says if you have fear, you have
Karma, right.
Tell us a little bit more.
Oh, that's it. I don't do that Instagram account at all. It's done by a friend of mine. So I'm always so happy when somebody actually looks at it. I don't want to even tell you how ignorant I am of Instagram, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay. Karma is a very interesting word. And the more these Sanskrit words come into common English usage, the more wildly misunderstood they are. So karma is one of those words that's just wildly and gloriously, almost amazingly misunderstood. My favorite of all the popularizations of karma was, they used to publish something called Harlequin Romances. Do they still publish those books? And they were just love stories, in which there would always be the moment when she would kiss him and the whole world would open. They were very predictable, and they were actually quite fun. So in the grocery store, there was one of those, and there's this picture of this woman, and she's there, and you see this one face, men's face on this side, and one man's face on this side, and the heading is, was it Eloise's karma to be with Harold? Or was her karma to be with Richard? And I thought, boy, we've made it totally into the mainstream. Okay, but what karma is the force that keeps causing us to have to have more experiences so that we can understand what causes suffering and what brings happiness. Because if you think about all your life experiences, you go toward things you think will make you happy, and they either do or don't. And we have attitudes and feelings and actions, and they either make us happy or they don't. And since our destiny is to be infinite in our awareness and perfectly blissful, and that is how we're made. Someone said to me, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, life is the only game in which the game is to figure out what the rules are. And the rules we're trying to figure out is what causes suffering and what causes happiness. And if we look at all our experiences honestly, we realize that's what the progress is. We're disillusioned, or we're disappointed, or we're fulfilled. We're fulfilled and we realize why, what caused it, what made it work, and how fully satisfying was that fulfillment. Because we learn from being fulfilled as well as from being thwarted. Now I have money, now I have a house, now I have children who, are making a living on their own. Am I satisfied? Or is there something more that my heart is longing for? There's much more suicide among rich people than poor people, because they have everything they're supposed to have and they're still not happy. Okay? So another way of describing karma is something you don't yet understand. You don't yet know about what causes happiness and what causes suffering. So it's a simple way is to say karma is an unlearned lesson. Another thing you might call karma is ignorance. Ignorance of what causes happiness and what causes suffering. And because we have free will, and because God loves us, and however you think about God like that, but because there is a divine power guiding us that loves us, it's going to keep helping us to learn things. And so when I asked Swami once something about karma and something like that, he says, well, if you're still afraid of something, there's something about suffering and happiness in regard to that you haven't figured out yet. I have a natural fear, like many people do, of being incarcerated. I have a fear of physical pain. Most people have a fear of physical pain, but not everyone. I still believe that if my body is in pain, then my mind has to suffer. And that doesn't mean that physical pain is anything I seek, but I'm consciously afraid of it. I'm afraid of being betrayed by my friends. I'm afraid of a whole lot of other things that might be good. You could be afraid of having too much money. What would I do with all that money? You could be afraid of being in an intimate relationship. You could be afraid of being a parent. You could be afraid of going to college. Because there's something in that situation that you need to face in order to learn what causes happiness and what causes suffering. And when you finally understand that, then you're not afraid of anything. Because what could happen to you that's going to take away your happiness or your suffering? This is why you have the extraordinary life of Jesus Christ, who came and willingly accepted crucifixion. He could have run away from those Roman guards. He could have not created so much controversy that made the corrupt priesthood of the time, the fact that it happened to be the Jewish faith, that wasn't the point. The point was they were a corrupt priesthood. He was disrupting their gig. He could have just left them alone, but he had an example to set, and he was completely fearless in the face of that. Even now, my Father could send legions of angels to rescue me. But it is in the fulfillment of righteousness that we will do this. I mean, how can you be that unafraid? Because you have understood what causes happiness and what causes suffering, which includes Jesus Christ was an event for which he was responsible. And even the body did not define him. It was in context. So he was born, and I actually say on one of those Instagram things, and I'm very embarrassed now, I said that Jesus said he was born without sin. And on that Instagram account, somebody says, where is that in the Bible? And oh my gosh, it isn't in the Bible. Somewhere in my life, I just made it up that Jesus said that. And I actually haven't gotten around to answering that Instagram quote and say, oops, my bad. However, the teaching is true. Jesus was born without karma because there was nothing, he had no ignorance. So there we are. Yeah. Okay. Colin is taking over.